Hello and welcome back to Storytime with Stories of the Shinsengumi, Hakuoki. We left off just about to get a tour of the facility, which is kind of what we were hoping for. So, good thing that worked out. And here we go. It was infectious, and I quickly found myself laughing along with them. Nagakura, on the other hand, had little cause for levity. I heard later that he and Inoue spent the rest of the day training, just the two of them. Nagakura's mouth was always in motion, and plenty that came out of it was none too nice, but underneath all that was a good man. I watched shadows drift up my wall as the orange light of the sun painted my room the color of autumn leaves. So what, I'm not gonna get a tour? Solitude was proving detrimental to any sort of continued optimism. All my thoughts eventually turned dark and hopeless. It was depressing, but most of all, it was frustrating. How could I let myself be discouraged so easily? Fairly easily, actually. I had been swept up in a frightening world I didn't understand and couldn't possibly control. All I could do was wait. Oh no! No! Fuck! Fuck! Hello and welcome back to Storytime with Hakuoki. We left off just about to get a tour of the facility, and that's kind of what we were looking for, so hopefully we can get that taken care of. And off we go. It was infectious, and she quickly found herself laughing along with them. Nagakura, on the other hand, had little cause for levity. She heard later that he and Inoue spent the rest of the day training, just the two of them. Nagakura's mouth was always in motion, and plenty that came out of it was none too nice. But underneath, all that was a good man. She watched shadows drift up her wall as the orange light of the sun painted her room the color of autumn leaves. Solitude was proving detrimental to any sort of continued optimism. All her thoughts eventually turned dark and hopeless. It was depressing, but most of all, it was frustrating. How could she let herself be discouraged so easily? Fairly easy, actually. She'd been swept up in a frightening world she didn't understand and couldn't possibly control. All she could do was wait. Lamenting things she couldn't change wouldn't improve her situation and would arguably make it worse. Still, there was at least one thing she had to be thankful for. She knew she couldn't trust the men of the Shinsengumi completely. They were, after all, men who could take her life in the blink of an eye. Oh, let's just take life. Alright. It would be all too easy for the next life they took to be hers.
Kimiさ、騙されやすい性格とか言われない?
Her voice froze in her throat. She turned slowly to find Okita standing behind her. Yes, Okita.
あれ? もしかして気づいてなかったとか? この時間帯は僕が君の監視役なんだけどな。
Of course, she was under surveillance, which meant
Hmm?
He said nothing, only smiled and blinked laconically. He'd heard her. He had definitely heard her. She wanted to scream, but before she could open her mouth, Saito stepped out from behind the door.
掃除、無駄話はそれくらいにしておけ。つい先ほど来たばかりだが。
She pressed her hand to her chest in an effort to calm her pounding heart.
気にするな。そもそも今の独り言は聞かれて困るような内容でもないだろう。
Then, he had heard her. It's embarrassing being caught talking to oneself. She was so embarrassed. Saito looked from her to Okita and back, and his brows drew together almost imperceptibly.
夕飯の支度ができたんだが、邪魔をしただろうか。
She shook her head emphatically.
あんたと掃除の話に一区切りついたら声をかけるつもりだったんだが。
He let the words hang in the air, but his eyes said that he determined they'd continue forever if he didn't interrupt. She had opened her mouth to say, she wasn't quite sure what, when. The moment he saw them, however, his face fell.
あー、ちょいちょいはじめくん、何仲良くおしゃべりしてんのさ。
すまない、取り込み中だった。
Axiskae perked up at Saito's apology, and he gave the other man a quick grin.
飯の時間なんだからさ、早く行こうぜ。食うものなくなっちまうよ。
Toto's getting jealous? Is that what that is?
遅えよ。
The moment they stepped into the dining hall, Nagakura and Harada looked up at them.
おめえら遅えんだよ。この俺の腹の高鳴りどうしてくるんだ。
新八さん、それってただ腹が鳴ってるだけだろ。困るよね、こういう単純な人。
お前らが来るまで食い始めるのを待っててやった俺様の寛大な腹に感謝しやがれ。新八、それ寛大な心だろ。ま、いつものように自分の飯は自分で守れよ。今日も相変わらずせこい夕飯だよな。というわけで、隣の晩ご飯突撃だ。弱肉強食の時代、俺様がいただくぜ。
ちょっと新八さん、なんで俺のおかずばっか狙うかな。
それは体の大きさだ。大きいやつにはそれなりに食う量が必要なんだよ。
じゃあ育ち盛りの俺はもっともっと食わないとね。
毎回毎回こんなんで済まないな。
慣れとは恐ろしいものだな。このおかず、俺がいただく。
うん。あんまり腹いっぱいに食べるとバカになるしね。
おいおい、バカとは聞き捨て。だが、その飯いただく。
どうぞ。僕はお酒をちびちびしてればいいし。
じゃあ、俺も酒にするかな。
ただ飯とか気にしないで、お腹いっぱい食べるんだよ。
気にしたら負けだ。自分の飯は自分で守る。
It was actually rather fun to have dinner with such a strange group of men. She'd eaten alone for so long that to do so with others was frightening and exhilarating all at once.
最初からそうやって笑ってろ。俺らもお前を悪いようにはしないさ。
His mouth curled up into an honest smile of his own. Had she really looked so down? Perhaps they were all trying to cheer her up. She wasn't quite sure how to feel. There was a part of her that felt bad, while another part felt a certain amount of joy. The joy seemed to be winning out, however, and she was smiling to herself when Inoue stepped in from the hall.
ちょっといいかいみんな。
As usual, his voice was warm, but in his eyes was a level of solemnity she'd never seen before, at least during their thus far brief acquaintance. The warmth of the room disappeared almost immediately.
大阪にいる土方さんから手紙が届いたんだが、三男さんがタイム中に重傷を負ったらしい。
They all went quiet. Inoue continued. Sinan had gone to investigate a report of several Ronin harassing a cloth merchant. He'd managed to drive them off, but not before being wounded by the Ronin.
相当の深手だと手紙に書いてあるけど、傷は左腕とのことだ。剣を握るのは難しいが、命に別状はないらしい。
She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding in, but it seemed that the rest of the room didn't share her relief.
数日中には屯所へ帰り着くんじゃないかな。それじゃ、私は近藤さんと話があるから。
He turned as he spoke, his last words delivered over his shoulder, and was gone. It was Saito who eventually broke the awkward silence.
刀は片腕で容易に扱えるものではない。最悪、三男さんは二度と真剣を震えまい。
At last, she understood. Yes, Sinan was alive, but without the ability to wield a sword. Sinan the man had survived the encounter with the Ronin, but Sinan the warrior had not.
片腕で扱えば刀の威力は損なわれる。そしてつばぜり合いになれば確実に負ける。
Fighting with one hand would be fighting at half strength. Even a skilled warrior would have trouble. Okita sighed.
薬でも何でも使ってもらうしかないですね。三男さんも納得してくれるんじゃないかな。
掃除。めったなこと言うもんじゃねえ。幹部が新選組入りしてどうするんだよ。
Wait, that didn't make any sense. She didn't understand. What was the core if it wasn't the Shinsengumi itself? But the way they'd said it, they couldn't have been referring to the Shinsengumi.
普通の新選組ってこう書くだろ。新選組は千の字を手辺にして
平助
What? Revealing secrets. Before she could move, Harada was on his feet and halfway across the room. She barely had time to gasp before he drove his fist into Heisuke. Nagakura sighed.
やりすぎだぞ佐野。英介もこいつのことを考えてやってくれ。
His eyes were cold and hard as he turned to look straight at her. It was clear Heisuke had told her something he shouldn't have. But what?
悪かったな。
After a moment, Harada gave the younger man a curt nod of apology, and Heisuke responded with a quick, pained smile.
いや今のは俺も悪かったけどったく佐野さんはすぐ手が出るんだからな。
His punch had hit him with enough force to knock a lesser man out cold, but Hakuoki seemed only slightly for the worse for wear. It had never been clearer that she was not among normal people.
今の話は君に聞かせられるギリギリのところだ。これ以上のことは教えられねえんだ。気になるだろうけど、何も聞かないでほしい。
His voice was friendly enough, but his eyes gave his words a cold weight that made her feel almost uncomfortable. How was she supposed to just drop it?
新選組っていうのはかわいそうな子たちのことだよ。
Okida's voice was flat, emotionless. His eyes were grim, and there was a sudden chill melancholy about him. She couldn't bring herself to say anything more. Thankfully, Nagakura stepped in to break the silence.
お前は何も気にしなくていいんだって。だからそんな顔するなよ。
She was only a guest in their house, not a warrior of the Shinsengumi. She didn't need to know the truth behind whatever secrets the Shinsengumi kept. She'd known that from the beginning. That knowledge was little comfort, however.
忘れろ。深く踏み込めば、お前の生き死ににも関わりかねん。
She bit her lip and kept silent. The wall between them was almost a physical thing, and it was far too large an obstacle for her to defeat easily. She finished her dinner in sad silence, excused herself, and returned to her room. She had a great deal to think about. She knew of the Shinsengumi, of course. Their name meant Elite Volunteer Corps. But this corps they'd mentioned, it seemed to be something different. The way they'd said it, it seemed as if the corps was another entity inside the Shinsengumi. That's about right. No! She wasn't supposed to think about those things. She was only going to get herself in trouble if she stuck her nose where it didn't belong. If she saw or heard the wrong thing, she could even end up dead. There were people who cared about her, and her death would no doubt sadden them. With that in mind, she did her best to put the day's events out of her head, and climbed onto her thin futon. It was later that day that Hijikata called for her. She had been relieved to find Okita and Hakuoki had been summoned along with her. A private conversation with only herself and Hijikata would have been cause for a significant case of nerves. Not even paying attention anymore. She was still trying to puzzle out what to say when Hijikata began to speak, his voice cold as tempered steel.
お前に外出許可をくれてやる。
His announcement was so sudden that she found she couldn't contain her enthusiasm. Hijikata, however, remained his composure.
市中を巡察する大使に同行しろ。隊を束ねる組長の指示には必ず従え。
At last, she would be able to go outside. She would finally be able to begin searching for her father. Her answers wouldn't show themselves immediately, she knew, but at least she was free to look for them.
ソジ、ヘイスケ、今日の巡察はお前らの隊だったな。
なる ほどね。だから当番の俺らが呼ばれたってわけか。
The confusion that had been on his face since she'd entered lifted at last.
でも今回は俺より掃除向きじゃないかな。今日は掃除の一番組が昼の巡察を担当だろ。
平助の8番組は夜担当だし、夜より昼が安全だっていうのは僕も同じ意見。
No, I gotta go with Okita. He nodded at Heisuke and gave her a quick wink.
でも逃げようとしたら殺すよ。老子に絡まれても見捨てるけどいい？
He wasn't being serious, but Hijikata turned his cold glare on Okita and frowned.
いいわけねえだろうがバカ。何のためにお前に任せると思ってんだ。
Okita's only response was a short snort of a laugh. She knew he wasn't being serious, but she couldn't stand to keep her mouth shut. And she still wanted to find him, just as much as she had the day she first met the Shinsengumi. She gave Okita a short bow, never taking her eyes off his face. The smirk that had been on his face when she'd begun had shrunk to something smaller and more than a little awkward.
ごめんね。少しからかいすぎたかな。でも何が起きるかわからないのは本当だから。危険を承知でついてくるっていうなら、僕の一番組に同行してくれて構わないよ。
Even she knew that Kyoto was not safe. But she didn't care. She had to find her father. At that moment, any possible dangers seemed immaterial.
長州の連中が不穏な動きを見せている。本来ならお前を外に出せる時期じゃない。
He seemed to be almost talking to himself, but his tone was stern and thoughtful. The soldiers of the Chonshu domain were part of the Imperial Nationalist Party. They had increasingly been turning to force in their pursuit of these goals. The Shinsengumi, on the other hand, were loyal to the shogun. Since their masters were at odds, the Shinsengumi and the Choshu domain were enemies. It occurred to her that the increased activity of the Choshu domain had likely made it difficult for the Shinsengumi to shoulder a burden such as her. Hijikata's face hardened, and he looked away.
江戸の家にも帰ってねえらしいし、今日の街中で行動さんらしい人物を見たっていう証言も上がっている。それに半年近くも辛抱させたしな。機会を見送り続けたんじゃ行動さん探しもこのまま進まねえだろう。
It wasn't what she'd expected to hear from him. He was right that they'd postponed her search for her father for quite some time. What she hadn't expected was that he would give any thought to her feelings on the matter. She bowed as she spoke, not sure what else she could do to express her gratitude. Hijikata only turned back to his work.
それに今は腹を壊してる大使も多いしな。俺らも万全の状態じゃないし。
Heisuke's joking didn't seem to appeal to Hijikata, who only frowned more deeply. It certainly had been. Day after day, the sun burned down on Kyoto from a cloudless sky, and all of the rooms in the compound were so humid that she felt dizzy as soon as she stepped inside. She had heard that the heat had been too much for some of the Shinsengumi soldiers, and they'd taken ill.
とにかく俺は許可を出してやる。行くか行かないかはお前が好きに判断しろ。
She sat there for a moment and considered her options. There was something in his words and demeanor that told her he didn't want her to leave the compound. Still, if she was with Okita or Heisuke, she had no doubt that she'd be safe and well protected. On the other hand, her presence could easily be an undue burden to them. What was she to do? Obviously, we're going to leave the compound. I mean, we're going out with Okita, we're going to be fine. The streets were full, packed with people. Nothing strange in a busy city, of course, but she could feel her heart beating faster all the same.
はしゃぎすぎ。巡察に同行してるんだってこと忘れないでね。
His wry smile was a friendly warning, but she shrunk back, cowed, and looked back up at him meekly. Cowed? Cowed? I think it's supposed to say bowed, honestly. Getting worked up over a busy city street was a silly thing for anyone to do, and they both knew it. But she'd been inside for so long, just the sight of crowds was enough to get her blood pumping.
まあ、祇園祭りも近いしね。街が浮き立ってるのは僕も否定しないけど。でも、上位ハロー士たちの動きが怪しいのは本当だから、僕たちから離れて勝手に動くのだけはなしね。
They were walking down Kyoto's largest street, accompanied by the First Division. No one came within a few yards of them as they walked. They stepped away at the moment their eyes caught the bright blue of the Shinsengumi's jackets. Even the people of Kyoto feared the Shinsengumi. She paused every so often to ask some of their less intimidated passerbys if they might have seen her father. After several regretful apologies, she came across someone who'd claimed to have seen a man matching her description.
そんな雰囲気の人ならしばらく前にそこのマス屋さんで見かけたよ。
As he spoke, he pointed towards the store selling wood and charcoal. Of course, she told herself, it could be someone who only looks like her father. Then again, perhaps it was her father. And with that little cliffhanger, we will stop here and continue on next time into the wood and charcoal shop. Yeah. Alright, till then. Bye-bye.